3 days after the transplant that was meant to save him, Lucas stops breathing. Alarms explode through the ICU. Doctors swarm the 6-year-old's room while his billionaire father watches helplessly through glass. The housekeeper who sacrificed her own bone marrow stands beside him, tears streaming, whispering he's a fighter. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. Paul Morrison sat in the pediatric oncologist's office, staring at the anatomical posters on the wall like they held some secret answer the doctor hadn't given him. His hands gripped the leather armrests of the chair so hard his knuckles had gone white, bloodless. The doctor's words kept echoing in his skull, bouncing around like bullets ricocheting off metal. 6 months. Maybe 8 if we're lucky. There's nothing more we can do. I'm so sorry, Mr. Morrison. Paul wanted to scream that sorry wasn't enough. That sorry couldn't save his 6-year-old twin boys. That sorry was just a word people said when they had given up. But instead, he sat there, frozen, feeling like someone had reached into his chest and yanked out everything that mattered. Dr. Chen had kept talking. Something about palliative care and making them comfortable and cherishing the time they had left. But Paul had stopped listening after the 6 months part. His boys, his Lucas and Liam, with their matching dimples and completely opposite personalities, had some rare genetic disorder with a name Paul couldn't even pronounce. The kind of thing that showed up in medical journals, not in his perfect, controlled life. He walked out of that office into the harsh California sunlight feeling like a ghost. His phone buzzed with texts from his assistant about board meetings and merger negotiations, but he couldn't make his fingers work to respond. How was he supposed to care about quarterly earnings when his children were dying? The drive home was a blur. Paul barely remembered getting on the highway, barely noticed the other cars. His mind kept replaying moments. Lucas's laugh when Paul threw him in the pool last summer. Liam's serious little face when he tried to explain the plot of his favorite cartoon. The way they both climbed into his bed on Saturday mornings, one on each side, arguing about what to watch. All of it would be gone. In 6 months, maybe 8 if they were lucky. His boys would just be memories. The thought made his throat close up, made it hard to breathe. When he pulled into the circular driveway of his Malibu estate, the house looked exactly the same as it had that morning, which felt wrong somehow. The world should have changed. The sky should be darker. Something should be different to mark the fact that his entire life had just shattered. He sat in the car for 10 minutes, hands still on the steering wheel, trying to figure out how to walk inside and pretend everything was fine. The boys were in there, probably playing video games or fighting over toys, completely unaware that their father had just been told they were dying. Paul finally forced himself out of the car. Each step toward the front door felt like walking through concrete. He could hear voices inside, laughter. The boys were alive right now, in this moment, and he had to hold on to that. He opened the door and immediately heard Lucas shouting from the living room. "Dad, Dad." Natalie taught us how to make volcanoes, and it exploded everywhere, and Liam got baking soda in his hair. Paul walked toward the sound and stopped in the doorway. The living room looked like a science experiment had gone catastrophically wrong. There was white powder on the hardwood floors, red food coloring splattered on the coffee table, and his twin boys were covered head to toe in some kind of foam. And standing in the middle of the chaos, completely unbothered by the disaster zone, was Natalie Williams, his housekeeper, laughing with her whole body like this was the best day of her life. She was wearing her usual uniform, simple black pants and a white shirt, but somehow she made it look elegant. Her dark skin glowed in the afternoon light coming through the windows, and her hair was pulled back in a neat bun that had somehow survived whatever explosion had just occurred. She was 32, had been working for him for 3 years, and Paul had never really looked at her before. Not really. She was just the person who kept his house running, who showed up 6 days a week, who was always there but somehow invisible. Until now. Now he saw her crouched down between his boys, her hands covered in the same foam as theirs, her smile genuine and wide as Lucas tried to explain the chemical reaction they'd created. She listened like it was the most fascinating thing she'd ever heard, asked questions that made Liam jump in with his own theories, and somehow made this complete mess feel like magic. "Mr. Morrison," Natalie said, finally noticing him in the doorway. Her smile dimmed slightly, replaced by something more professional. Sorry about the mess. We were doing a science experiment and things got a bit out of hand. I'll have it cleaned up in 20 minutes. Paul opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He just stood there, looking at his boys covered in foam and baking soda, laughing and alive and here, and something in his chest cracked wide open. Natalie's expression shifted. She stood up slowly, her eyes scanning his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, her voice different now, concerned. "Are you okay?" "No," he wanted to say. "No, I'm not okay. My boys are dying and I don't know how to save them, and I just spent an hour listening to a doctor tell me to prepare for their deaths." But instead, he heard himself say, "I need to speak with you. In my office. Now." The boys immediately protested. "Dad, we're in the middle of an experiment. Can Natalie stay? We haven't done the second eruption yet." Paul forced something that might have been a smile. "You two keep playing. Natalie will be back in a few minutes. Clean up when you're done." As he walked toward his office, he heard Natalie giving the boys quick instructions. Something about letting the foam settle before they started cleaning. Then her footsteps followed him down the hallway. His office was his sanctuary, all dark wood and leather, walls lined with books he'd never read, and awards he'd stopped caring about. He closed the door behind Natalie and then just stood there, not sure where to start. She waited, patient, her hands clasped in front of her. She didn't fidget, didn't look nervous, just stood there with this calm presence that made him feel like maybe the world wasn't completely falling apart. "I got news today," Paul finally said, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. "About the boys." Natalie's entire body tensed. She took a small step forward. "What kind of news?" "The doctors. They've been running tests for weeks. The fatigue, the bruising, the fevers. We thought it was just normal kid stuff, maybe anemia. But it's not." He had to stop, had to force air into his lungs. "It's worse. Much worse." Natalie didn't say anything, but he saw her hands tighten around each other, saw the way her eyes widened slightly. "Tell me," she said softly. "They have a genetic disorder. It's rare. Affects maybe 1 in 5 million people. It's been damaging their organs, their immune systems. The doctors have tried everything. There's no cure, no treatment that works. They have 6 months, maybe 8 if we're lucky." The silence that followed was suffocating. Paul watched Natalie's face, watched the information land, watched her process it. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She just stood there, breathing carefully, like she was trying to hold herself together. "How sure are they?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Paul laughed, but it came out broken. "They're sure. They've run every test twice, consulted with specialists across the country. This is it. This is all the time we have left." Natalie pressed her hand to her mouth. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Paul could hear the boys laughing in the living room, could hear them arguing about whose turn it was to add more vinegar, the sound of normal life, of childhood, of time they didn't have. "I'm so sorry," Natalie finally said, and the way she said it, full of genuine pain and grief, made something in Paul break completely. He turned away from her, pressed his palms against his desk, trying to hold himself upright. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I've built a fortune, run a company with 3,000 employees, negotiated deals worth billions. But I can't fix this. I can't save them." I stood in that doctor's office, and all I could think was that I would give everything, every dollar, every asset, everything I own to buy them more time. And it doesn't matter. Money doesn't matter. He felt her hand on his shoulder, gentle, steadying. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "they're still here. Right now in this moment, they're alive and happy and covered in foam because we made a volcano in your living room. That's what matters." Paul turned to look at her. She was crying now, tears running down her face, but her expression was fierce. 6 months is 6 months of memories," she continued. 6 months of laughter and hugs and bedtime stories. 6 months of making every single day count for something. You can't save them from what's coming. but you can give them the best life possible right now. How? Paul asked, his voice raw. How do I watch them die? How do I wake up every morning knowing I'm one day closer to losing them? Natalie's hand stayed on his shoulder. You do it the same way you've done everything else in their lives. You show up. You love them. You make them feel safe and cherished and important. And when it gets too hard, when you can't breathe from the pain of it, you lean on the people around you who care about them too. Paul realized she was including herself in that statement. In 3 years of working for him, he'd never really thought about what Natalie felt about his boys. She was the hired help, someone who did a job. But looking at her now, at the genuine grief and determination in her eyes, he understood that she loved Lucas and Liam. Not because she was paid to, but because that's who she was. What do we tell them? Paul asked. Nothing yet, Natalie said firmly. They don't need to know they're dying. They just need to know they're loved. There will be a time to talk about it, but not today. Today they're making volcanoes and being kids. Let them have that for as long as possible. Paul nodded, unable to trust his voice. Natalie squeezed his shoulder once, then stepped back. I should get back to them before they decide to make another eruption without supervision. But Mr. Morrison, if you need anything at all, I'm here. Not just as your employee, as someone who cares about those boys. As she turned to leave, Paul heard himself say, Natalie. She paused, hand on the doorknob. Thank you for loving them. She looked back at him, and he saw something shift in her expression, something determined and almost fierce. Mr. Morrison, I would do anything for Lucas and Liam. Anything. Remember that. Over the next 2 weeks, Paul tried to keep things normal. He went to work, came home, had dinner with the boys. He read them bedtime stories and helped with homework and pretended his world wasn't ending. But everything was different now. Every cough made his heart stop. Every time one of the boys said they were tired, Paul felt panic claw at his throat. He found himself memorizing things, cataloging moments. The way Lucas always put on his left sock before his right sock, a ritual he'd had since he was 3 years old. The way Liam organized his toy cars by color instead of size, lining them up in rainbow order across his bedroom floor. The sound of their voices calling for him when they had nightmares. The way they both said daddy with 2 syllables, stretched out and needy. The way Lucas smelled like grass and sweat after playing outside. The way Liam's nose crinkled when he laughed really hard. The exact shade of brown in their eyes, darker than Paul's, inherited from their mother who'd left when they were babies. All of it suddenly precious, suddenly finite. Paul started taking videos of everything. The boys eating breakfast, arguing over the remote, brushing their teeth. Mundane moments he'd never bothered capturing before suddenly felt like treasures. He needed proof that they had existed, that they had been here, that they had filled his life with light and noise and purpose. At work, Paul couldn't concentrate. He'd be in the middle of a presentation and suddenly forget what he was saying, his mind hijacked by the image of Lucas hooked up to machines or Liam too weak to walk. His assistant started running interference, rescheduling meetings, making excuses. The board members whispered in corners, concerned about their CEO's sudden decline in performance. Paul didn't care. Let them whisper. Let them worry. His sons were dying. Nothing else mattered. Natalie became his lifeline without either of them planning it. She was just there, consistently, creating normalcy when everything felt like chaos. She made the boys breakfast while Paul got ready for work, and Paul would come downstairs to find them all laughing about something silly, covered in pancake batter or syrup. She helped with homework in the afternoons, patiently explaining fractions in 5 different ways until Liam finally understood. She invented games and projects that kept them engaged and happy, turning ordinary days into adventures. And somehow, in between all of that, she kept the house running like nothing had changed. But Paul noticed she never let the boys overexert themselves anymore. She watched them carefully, adjusted activities when they seemed tired, made rest time feel like a game instead of a medical necessity. She was managing their decline with such skill that the boys didn't even realize she was doing it. Paul started noticing things about her he'd never paid attention to before. The way she hummed while she cleaned, always slightly off-key, usually old R&B songs from the 70s. The way she talked to the boys, never condescending, always treating them like their opinions mattered, even when they were arguing about whether dinosaurs could beat superheroes in a fight. The way she moved through the house with quiet efficiency, anticipating needs before anyone voiced them, refilling Paul's coffee before he realized his cup was empty, laying out the boys' pajamas before they came upstairs for bed. She wore her hair different ways, he noticed. Some days in a bun, some days in braids, once in a while loose around her shoulders. She had a small scar on her left hand, between her thumb and forefinger. She rubbed it unconsciously when she was thinking. She took her coffee with cream but no sugar. She always kicked off her shoes the moment she walked in the door, padding around the house in mismatched socks. These small details, things he'd never bothered to notice in 3 years, suddenly felt important. She was beautiful, he realized one afternoon, watching her show Lucas how to plant seeds in the garden. Not in the polished, artificial way of the women he usually dated, the ones who showed up to charity galas in designer gowns and left before breakfast, the ones who saw him as a conquest or a bank account. Natalie's beauty was something different, something real. It was in her laugh, genuine and full-bodied, the kind that made other people want to laugh too. It was in her patience, the way she could explain the same thing 10 times without frustration. It was in the way she listened with her whole body like nothing else in the world mattered, except what his son was saying about dirt and earthworms. Paul found himself watching her more than he should. The curve of her neck when she bent to tie Lucas's shoes, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled, the grace in her movements, economical and purposeful. Once, he caught himself staring at her mouth while she talked, wondering what it would feel like to kiss her, and the thought shocked him so badly he had to leave the room. He was falling for her, he realized with a jolt one evening. Falling for his housekeeper, falling for the woman who was helping him prepare to lose his children. The timing was impossible, inappropriate, completely wrong. But feelings didn't care about timing or appropriateness. They just existed, stubborn and insistent, growing stronger every day. 3 weeks after the diagnosis, Paul walked into the kitchen and found Natalie sitting at the island with a notebook, writing furiously. She didn't notice him at first, too focused on whatever she was creating. "What are you working on?" Paul asked, making her jump slightly. "Oh, Mr. Morrison, I didn't hear you come in." She closed the notebook quickly, but not before Paul caught a glimpse of what looked like lists and drawings. Just some ideas for activities with the boys. Paul poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. "What kind of activities?" Natalie hesitated, then opened the notebook. Paul saw pages filled with ideas. A bucket list, essentially. Things like visit the beach at sunset, build the tallest blanket fort ever, have a paint fight, learn to make pizza from scratch, camp in the backyard, visit the aquarium, make a time capsule. There were dozens of items, each one carefully thought out. "I've been thinking," Natalie said quietly, "about making every day count, creating special experiences for them. Things they'll remember, things that make this time feel full instead of just sad." Paul stared at the list, something tight forming in his chest. "You did all this?" Natalie shrugged. "I love those boys, Mr. Morrison. I want them to have every beautiful moment possible. And honestly, I think it might help you too. Having concrete things to look forward to. When was the last time you did something just for fun with them?" Paul couldn't remember. "Can I?" he asked, gesturing to the notebook. Natalie slid it across the island. Paul flipped through the pages, seeing her neat handwriting, little sketches she'd added. There was so much thought here, so much care. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Natalie met his eyes. "I never was just the housekeeper, Mr. Morrison. Those boys, from day one, they saw me. They cared about my day, asked about my life, made me drawings. They made me feel like family. So I'm doing this because when you love someone, you show up for them. Especially when things are hard." "What's first on the list?" he asked quietly. Natalie smiled. "Beach at sunset. Tomorrow's supposed to be clear. We could pack a picnic, let them play in the water, watch the sun go down. Just the 4 of us." The next evening, they drove to a private beach Paul owned. The boys were ecstatic, bouncing in the back seat. Natalie sat in the passenger seat, her window down, hair blowing in the wind. She looked relaxed, wearing jeans and a simple blue t-shirt instead of her uniform. At the beach, the boys exploded out of the car. They raced toward the water, screaming with joy. Natalie laughed and chased after them. Paul stood by the car, watching the three of them, and felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. The evening was perfect. They built sand castles and searched for crabs and played in the waves. Paul couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed this much. As the sun started to set, they spread out blankets and ate sandwiches. The boys were finally quiet, exhausted, and happy, leaning against Paul on either side. Natalie sat across from them, her face glowing in the golden light. "This is perfect," Liam said softly. "This is the best day ever." Lucas nodded in agreement, already half asleep. Paul looked at Natalie over his son's heads and mouthed, "Thank you." She smiled back, and Paul felt something shift in his chest, something warm and terrifying. Over the next month, they worked through Natalie's list. They built the blanket fort. They had the paint fight. They made pizza from scratch. They camped in the backyard, told ghost stories, stayed up past midnight. And through all of it, Paul fell. Not just for the moments, but for Natalie. For the way she made everything feel possible. For her laugh and her creativity, and her absolute refusal to let sadness dominate their time. For the way she looked at his boys like they hung the moon. He knew it was complicated, but he couldn't help it. Somewhere between the beach sunset and the backyard camping trip, Natalie had become essential. 2 months after the diagnosis, Paul's mother called wanting to see the boys. He'd been avoiding telling his family, but his mother was persistent, and finally Paul agreed to Sunday dinner. "Bring that girlfriend of yours," his mother said, "the one your assistant mentioned." "Mom, I don't have a girlfriend." "Don't be ridiculous, Paul, everyone knows about her." "Natalie." Paul's stomach dropped. "Natalie's not my girlfriend. She's the housekeeper." His mother made a dismissive sound. "Housekeeper, girlfriend, whatever. Bring her." That evening he found Natalie in the kitchen. "My mother wants to meet you," Paul said. "She thinks you're my girlfriend." Natalie nearly dropped the knife. "What?" "I didn't tell her that. My assistant mentioned you and my mother jumped to conclusions. She insists you come to Sunday dinner." Natalie set down the knife. "Mr. Morrison, I don't think that's appropriate. I work for you." "Please," Paul said. "The boys would want you there, and I can't face telling my family about the diagnosis without you." Natalie was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Okay, I'll come. But Mr. Morrison, after this, we need to talk about boundaries. About what this is becoming." Paul's heart was hammering. "What do you think it's becoming?" Natalie met his eyes. "I don't know," she said quietly. "But I think we both feel it. And that scares me." Sunday dinner was a disaster from the moment they arrived. Paul's mother, Patricia Morrison, took one look at Natalie, and her expression shifted from curious to cold. During dinner, things got worse. Patricia asked pointed questions about Natalie's background, her education, her family. She made comments about how difficult it must be to work in service. Finally, Patricia turned to him. "So, Paul, when were you planning to tell us the real reason you've been avoiding family events?" The boys were in the next room playing. Patricia leaned forward. "Rebecca told me she saw you coming out of Children's Hospital. What's going on with Lucas and Liam?" Paul took a breath and told them everything. The diagnosis, the prognosis, the 6 months that had now dwindled to 4. His mother's face went white. Rebecca started crying. And then the questions came, overwhelming. His mother turned to Natalie with accusation in her eyes. "And you knew about this? You've been there taking a paycheck while my grandsons are dying?" Natalie's body went rigid. Paul felt her try to pull her hand away, but he held on. "That's not fair," Paul said sharply. "Natalie has been the only thing holding us together. Don't you dare suggest she's only there for money." His mother's eyes narrowed. "Then why is she there, Paul? What exactly is her role?" Natalie stood up. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tight. I need some air." She left before anyone could stop her. Paul found her outside by the fountain. She was crying. "I shouldn't have come. This was a mistake." It wasn't," Paul said, moving beside her. "My mother was out of line." Natalie finally looked at him. "Do you know what the worst part is? I almost defended myself by telling her I loved them. But I stopped because the truth is, Mr. Morrison, it's not just them anymore." The air between them felt electric. "What do you mean?" Natalie laughed, but it sounded broken. "You really don't know? I'm saying I fell in love with your family, Paul. All of you. And I don't know how to step back, even though I know I should." Paul couldn't breathe. "Natalie," he started. "Don't," she said. "Please don't say anything right now. Not when the boys need us both. Let's just forget I said anything." But Paul couldn't forget. "What if I don't want to forget?" he said quietly. "What if I've been feeling the same thing?" Natalie's eyes widened. "Paul, don't. You're grieving. This isn't real." "How do you know?" Paul asked. "How do you know what I feel isn't real?" "Because I'm the housekeeper," Natalie said. "Because when this is over, when the boys are gone, you'll move on, and I'll just be the woman who helped you through a tragedy." Before Paul could argue, his sister appeared. "Paul, the boys are asking for you, and Mom wants to apologize to Natalie." That night, after they'd gotten the boys home, Paul stood outside Natalie's room and knocked. "Come in," she called. "I can't stop thinking about what you said," Paul admitted. "About falling in love. Natalie, I need you to know, I'm not confused. This isn't just crisis bonding." Natalie stood up. "Paul, even if that's true, we can't do this. Your boys are dying. That has to be the only priority." "And what if there is no after?" Paul asked. "What if I found someone who makes me feel alive and I'm supposed to ignore that?" Natalie crossed to him. "Then we wait," she said softly. "We focus on Lucas and Liam, and when it's over, if you still feel this way, then maybe we figure out what this is. But not now." She was right. Paul knew she was right. After, he agreed. Natalie's hand touched his face. Just once. After, she promised. 3 months into the 6 they'd been promised, things started to change. Lucas began having more bad days than good. Liam's energy levels dropped dramatically. The appointments became more frequent. Paul watched his boys slowly fading. Natalie never wavered. She became more determined, more creative. She learned to read the boys' energy levels, planned activities around their capabilities. On bad days, they watched movies in bed. On good days, they made the most of every minute. Paul found himself relying on her more, not just for the boys, but for his own sanity. Late at night, they would sit in the kitchen, drinking tea, talking. "Tell me about your family," Paul said one night. "Not much to tell," Natalie said. "My mom died when I was 12. Cancer. My dad worked 3 jobs. I have a younger brother, Marcus, in college now. Pre-med. I'm putting him through school." "That's why you work so much," Paul said. Natalie nodded. "The pay was good. I could help Marcus, save money. I have a degree in child development, but I needed the stability. You're amazing with the boys." "That's because I'm professionally trained," Natalie said. "I worked at a children's hospital for 2 years, in the palliative care unit." Paul felt like the air had been knocked out. "What?" Natalie's expression was complicated. "That's why I understood what you needed. I've been here before, Paul. I've sat with families during the worst days. I've helped create beautiful moments in the shadow of death. It's why I took this job. Something told me I was supposed to be here." Paul reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea." "It's okay," Natalie said. "It's part of who I am. And Paul, I want you to know something. I've seen miracles happen. I've seen kids beat impossible odds. So we keep hoping. But when the time comes, you'll help me? Help them? You'll make sure they're not scared?" Natalie squeezed his hand. "I'll make sure they feel nothing but love. I promise." Another month passed. They checked off more items. The boys got weaker. Then came the day Paul had been dreading. He found Natalie sitting with both boys, all three crying. "They asked me if they were dying," she said quietly. "What did you tell them?" "The truth," Natalie said, "that their bodies aren't working right. That yes, they're going to die, but not today. And that every moment until then they'll be loved." Paul sat down with them, gathered his boys close, and had the conversation. Lucas cried and asked if it would hurt. Liam wanted to know if they'd still be brothers in heaven. Natalie sat with them through all of it. Afterward, when the boys had fallen asleep, Paul and Natalie sat on the floor, backs against the couch. "I don't know how to do this," Paul whispered. "You don't have to be strong all the time," Natalie said. "That's why I'm here. We take turns falling apart. How are you so calm?" "Who says I don't break?" Natalie said. "I cry myself to sleep every night, because I love those boys and I can't save them. But in the morning, I get up and smile because that's what they need." Paul turned toward her, his hand cupping her face. "Natalie, I don't think I can do this without you." She leaned into his touch. "You won't have to. I'm not going anywhere." Their faces were inches apart. Every instinct told him to close the distance, to kiss her. But before he could, Natalie pulled back. "Not yet," she whispered. "After." The next morning, Paul woke to find Natalie's room empty. Panic clawed at his throat. He found a note on the kitchen counter. "Mr. Morrison, I've taken an emergency leave. Something has come up that I need to handle. I'll be in touch soon. Please take care of the boys. Tell them I love them." Paul read it 3 times. Emergency leave? Now? The boys woke up asking for her. Paul had no answer. He tried to call her cell. Nothing. 2 days went by with no word. Paul was going out of his mind. The boys kept asking when Natalie was coming back. Paul had no answer. On the 3rd day, his doorbell rang at 7 in the morning. Paul ran to answer it, hoping desperately it was Natalie. Instead, he found his assistant with a woman in a business suit. "Mr. Morrison," his assistant said. "This is Dr. Sarah Chen. She needs to speak with you urgently. It's about Natalie Williams." Paul's blood ran cold. What happened? Is she okay? Dr. Chen stepped forward. "Mr. Morrison, I'm the director of the National Marrow Donor Program. Natalie Williams contacted us 3 weeks ago. She's a genetic match for your sons." Paul stood frozen in his doorway, staring at Dr. Chen like she'd just spoken in a language he didn't understand. A genetic match. Natalie was a genetic match for his boys. The words didn't make sense. Couldn't make sense, because that would mean hope existed when he'd already accepted there was none. "What are you talking about?" Paul finally managed, his voice hoarse. "How is that even possible?" Dr. Chen gestured toward the house. "May I come in? This is a conversation that requires some explanation." Paul led her and his assistant to the living room, his mind spinning, his hands shaking so badly he had to clench them into fists. He sat down heavily, feeling like his legs might give out. Dr. Chen settled across from him, opening a folder filled with medical documents covered in terminology Paul couldn't begin to understand. 3 weeks ago, Natalie Williams registered with our bone marrow donor program. She submitted her genetic information and specifically requested testing against your son's profiles. The match came back positive, not just for one of your boys, but for both. She's a compatible donor for Lucas and Liam. Paul's chest felt tight. He couldn't breathe properly. That's impossible. The odds of finding a match, the doctor said it was millions to 1. "Actually," Dr. Chen said, "for siblings it's 1 in 4. For unrelated donors it's roughly 1 in 40,000 if we're very lucky." Natalie beat those odds. But here's what makes this truly extraordinary. The genetic disorder your sons have, it's been resistant to standard bone marrow transplants, because their immune systems reject the donor cells. We've tried this with other patients who have the same condition. None of them survived more than a few weeks. Paul felt hope draining away. "So what are you saying? That this won't work either?" Dr. Chen shook her head. "I'm saying Natalie's match is different. Match. Her genetic markers include a specific protein sequence that our research team believes might prevent rejection entirely. We've spent 3 days running every test. The preliminary data suggests her bone marrow could not only take root in your son's bodies, but actually repair the genetic damage. This isn't just about buying time. This could cure them completely. The room spun. You're telling me Natalie could save them? Save them completely? Dr. Chen nodded. If the transplant is successful, yes. Your boys could have normal, healthy lives. But I need to be clear about risks. This procedure is dangerous. Natalie would undergo bone marrow extraction, which is extraordinarily painful. For the boys, we'd have to destroy their existing immune systems with chemotherapy. If something goes wrong, they would die within weeks. What does Natalie say? Paul asked. Does she understand what she's volunteering for? Dr. Chen's expression softened. Mr. Morrison, I've been doing this for 20 years. I've never met a donor more determined or more informed. Natalie understands everything, and she's absolutely certain. Where is she now? Paul demanded. Why didn't she come herself? She's at the hospital. We've been keeping her under observation, running tests. She wanted to come, but I advised her to wait until we had all the information. She didn't want to give you false hope. Paul grabbed his keys. I need to see her, now. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Dr. Chen led him through corridors to a private room on the 4th floor. She's been anxious to see you, Dr. Chen said. But Mr. Morrison, Natalie's doing this out of love, not obligation. Whatever happens between you two personally, don't let that complicate the medical decision. Paul nodded. Dr. Chen knocked once, then opened the door. The room was sterile and bland. But sitting on the bed, wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, looking exhausted and nervous and beautiful, was Natalie. Her eyes met his. Mr. Morrison, she started, but Paul crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. He held her so tightly he could feel her heart hammering against his chest. You're a match, Paul said against her hair. You're a match and you didn't tell me. You just left. I'm sorry, Natalie whispered, her arms coming around him. I couldn't tell you until I knew for sure. I couldn't give you hope if it was going to be ripped away. But Paul, there's a chance now. A real chance to save them. Paul pulled back to look at her face. Do you understand what you're offering to do? The pain? The risk? I've read every medical journal article, Natalie said. I've talked to donors who've been through it. I know exactly what I'm signing up for. And I would do it 1,000 times over if it meant Lucas and Liam get to live. Why? Paul asked, his hands framing her face. Why would you do this? You owe us nothing. Because I love them, she said simply. Because I love those boys more than I've ever loved anything in my life. Because the thought of a world without their laughter, it's unbearable. I can save them, Paul. How could I not do everything possible? Paul kissed her. He'd been holding back for months, but in that moment, he couldn't anymore. He kissed her like she was oxygen, and he'd been drowning. She kissed him back with the same desperate intensity. When they broke apart, Natalie let out a watery laugh. That was supposed to wait until after. I know, Paul said, but I needed you to understand. This isn't just gratitude. I'm in love with you. I've been in love with you for months. Natalie closed her eyes, tears spilling over. I love you too. God help me, I love you too. But Paul, we can't think about that now. The boys, the transplant. That has to be everything. After they're safe, then we figure out what this is. Over the next hour, Dr. Chen explained the entire process. They would start Lucas and Liam on aggressive chemotherapy immediately. The treatment would make them desperately sick. After 2 weeks, Natalie would undergo bone marrow extraction. Those cells would be transplanted into the boys. Then came the waiting to see if it worked. The survival rate for this condition with transplant is less than 5%, Dr. Chen said. But the alternative is certain death. This gives them a fighting chance. How soon can we start? Paul asked. If you're both certain, we can admit the boys tomorrow. Start chemo by the end of the week. That night, Paul and Natalie sat the boys down and explained everything. Natalie's body makes special cells that could fix what's wrong inside you, Paul said. She's going to share those cells. but it means you'll feel really sick for a while. Will it hurt? Liam asked quietly. Natalie pulled both boys close. Yes, she said gently. It's going to hurt, and you're going to feel really bad. But your dad and I will be there every single day, and when it's over, you'll be able to run and play again. Will you still love us when we're better? Liam asked. Natalie's eyes filled with tears. I'll love you forever, no matter what. When you're sick, when you're healthy, nothing will ever change that. Both boys launched themselves at her, hugging tight. Paul watched his sons cling to the woman about to save their lives. The next week descended into carefully controlled hell that redefined everything Paul thought he knew about suffering. Lucas and Liam were admitted to the pediatric oncology unit, placed in adjoining isolation rooms with glass walls so they could see each other but couldn't risk cross-contamination. The rooms were sterile, everything white and clean and cold, with monitors beeping constantly, creating a soundtrack of anxiety. The chemotherapy started within 48 hours, and Paul watched his beautiful, vibrant boys transform into shadows of themselves. They vomited constantly, violently until there was nothing left in their stomachs and they were just dry heaving, their small bodies racked with spasms that made Paul want to scream. Their hair fell out in clumps, coming out on pillows, in the shower, in Paul's hands when he stroked their heads trying to comfort them. Their skin turned gray and papery, stretched too tight over bones that became visible as they lost weight with frightening speed. Their eyes, once bright and full of mischief, became dull and sunken, ringed with dark circles. They cried from pain and nausea and fear and exhaustion, these heartbreaking whimpers that tore Paul apart, and all he could do was hold their hands through latex gloves and tell them it would get better. Tell them to hold on. Tell them he loved them more than anything in the world. He felt helpless, completely powerless, watching his children suffer and being unable to take away even a fraction of their pain. Natalie was there every single day, despite the doctors telling her to rest, to preserve her strength for her own procedure that loomed ahead. She read to the boys in quiet voices when they were awake enough to listen, played gentle games that didn't require much energy, sang soft songs that made them smile even through their misery. She sat between their rooms, visible to both of them through the glass, a constant presence, a reminder of why they were suffering, a symbol of the hope that waited on the other side of this nightmare. And at night, after the boys finally fell into exhausted, medication-induced sleep, she and Paul would sit in the family waiting room on uncomfortable plastic chairs, holding each other, drawing strength from their connection, crying together when the weight became too much to bear alone. Sometimes they didn't talk at all, just sat in silence, their hands clasped, their grief and fear and love flowing between them without words. 2 weeks into chemo, the boys crashed. Both spiked fevers over 104. Their blood counts dropped dangerously low. Dr. Chen called them in. This is the critical point, she said. Their immune systems are destroyed. Any infection could kill them in hours. The next 48 hours will determine if they're strong enough to survive the transplant. Natalie stood up, her expression fierce. Then we do the transplant now. Today. If they're going to die anyway, let's give them the chance we promised. You're not ready, Dr. Chen protested. The harvest is scheduled for 3 days from now. I don't care, Natalie said. Those boys are dying right now at this moment. Take whatever you need from me. I can handle anything. The procedure was scheduled for that night. Paul wanted to stay with Natalie, but she insisted he be with the boys. They need to see you when they wake up, she said. I'll be fine. This is what I came here to do. Paul kissed her. You're the bravest person I've ever met. Natalie smiled. I'm terrified, but I'm doing it anyway. That's what love is, right? The bone marrow extraction took 4.5 hours. Natalie was under anesthesia while doctors used large needles to draw stem cells from her hip bones. Paul sat with Lucas and Liam, barely conscious, and tried to explain. Natalie's being so brave right now. She's sharing her special cells with you. When the doctors finally brought the harvested cells in bags, Paul stared at them. They looked so ordinary, just dark red liquid, but they contained all his hopes. The transfusion was anticlimactic. The cells dripped into the boys through their lines. Within 90 minutes, it was done. Natalie's bone marrow was inside his son's, Now came the hardest part. The waiting. Natalie was in recovery, in significant pain. Paul split his time between her and the boys, feeling torn in pieces. The boys remained critically ill, their bodies fighting battles Paul couldn't see. 3 days post-transplant, Lucas stopped breathing. Alarm screamed through the ICU. Doctors swarmed his room. Paul was pushed back, helpless, watching through glass. Natalie appeared beside him, having dragged herself from her bed despite pain. She was pale, moving slowly, but her hand found his. "He's going to make it," she said with absolute certainty. "He's a fighter." The medical team worked for 23 minutes that felt like years. Finally, Lucas's oxygen levels stabilized. He was breathing again, weak, but alive. "That was extremely close," the attending said. "His body's trying to reject the new cells. We've increased his immunosuppressants. The next 72 hours remain critical." 1 week post-transplant, there was no improvement. Both boys remained critically ill. Lucas developed pneumonia. Liam's kidneys started failing, requiring dialysis. The medical team began talking quietly about how long to continue aggressive interventions. Paul heard the unspoken message. They were preparing him to let go. Then, on day 10 post-transplant, something miraculous happened. Liam's white blood cell count started to rise. Not dramatically, just barely, but measurably. "The engraftment might be starting," Dr. Chen said cautiously. "We need sustained improvement before we celebrate. But this is encouraging." The next morning, Lucas's counts improved too. Slightly, barely detectable, but there. 2 days later, both boys had measurable white blood cells. Their bodies were producing new immune cells from Natalie's marrow. By day 15, they were conscious and talking, weak, exhausted, but present. Lucas looked at Paul with clear eyes for the first time in weeks and said, "Dad, I'm hungry. I want pancakes." Paul laughed and cried simultaneously. Natalie, who'd been sleeping in a chair beside Liam's bed, woke when Liam tugged her hand. "Did it work?" Liam asked, his voice small. "Are we going to be okay?" Natalie looked at his little face and smiled through tears. "Yeah, baby. I think you're going to be just fine." The next 6 weeks were a slow, painstaking crawl toward recovery that tested everyone's patience and faith. The boys' blood counts continued improving steadily, incrementally, each day bringing small victories that felt monumental. The new marrow was engrafting, taking root in their bones, beginning to produce healthy cells that didn't carry the genetic mutation that had been killing them from the inside. They graduated from the intensive care unit to the regular pediatric floor, a move that felt like ascending from hell to purgatory, still difficult, but measurably better. They started eating again, tentatively at first, just a few bites of applesauce or crackers, then gradually more substantial meals. They slowly regained the weight they'd lost, their faces filling out, their limbs losing that skeletal appearance that had haunted Paul's nightmares. Their hair began to grow back, soft baby fuzz that made them look impossibly young and fragile and new, like they were being reborn. They had good days where they laughed and played quiet games, and setbacks where fevers spiked and Paul's heart stopped. But the trajectory was unmistakably upward. Every morning, Paul woke up terrified that this would be the day things went wrong. But every evening, he went to bed with 2 sons who were still alive, still fighting, still winning. Natalie recovered from her procedure slowly, the extraction sites on her hips healing gradually, though she would carry the scars on her skin forever, permanent reminders of what she'd given, what she'd sacrificed. She never complained, never mentioned her own pain, even when Paul could see her wincing as she moved. She just kept showing up at the hospital, kept loving the boys through every difficult day, kept being the steady presence they all desperately needed. Paul watched her with amazement, with gratitude, with love that grew deeper every single day. "Both boys are showing complete engraftment," she said, unable to hide her smile. "The new marrow has integrated. Their blood work is completely normal. The genetic markers for their condition are gone, not reduced, gone entirely." Paul couldn't speak. Tears streamed down his face. Natalie's hand squeezed his so hard. "So they're cured," Paul finally choked out. They're actually cured. Dr. Chen nodded, tears in her eyes too. They're cured. You beat 1 in a million odds. Lucas and Liam are going to live normal, healthy lives. They'll need monitoring for the next year, but all indications are they're going to be fine. Paul turned to Natalie and pulled her into his arms, both crying too hard to speak, holding each other. They'd done it. 2 weeks later, Lucas and Liam walked out of the hospital. Thin, still weak, but they walked on their own feet. They came home to balloons and a banner saying, "Welcome home, champions." The boys walked into the house they'd left as dying children and returned as survivors. That night, after the boys were in bed, Paul found Natalie in the kitchen staring out at the ocean. "You saved them," Paul said quietly. "You gave my sons their lives back." Natalie turned. "We saved them. You, me, the doctors, all of us together." Paul shook his head. "Don't minimize what you did. You risked your life for children who weren't even yours." Natalie smiled. "They're mine in every way that matters. Love isn't about biology. It's about choice." 6 months passed in a blur of hospital checkups and cautious optimism. The boys grew stronger every single day. Their hair grew back thick and curly, exactly the way it had been before, as if their bodies were determined to erase every trace of what they'd been through. They gained weight steadily, their faces becoming round and healthy again, their limbs filling out with proper muscle, instead of the stick-thin fragility of illness. Their energy returned gradually, first in small bursts of play that lasted only minutes, then in longer periods of sustained activity. They looked like normal kids again, indistinguishable from any other 6-year-olds, except for the ports still embedded in their chests for blood draws, and the careful way they approached activities, like they were testing the limits of their new health. Paul gradually returned to work, but everything had changed fundamentally. His priorities had been completely reordered by crisis. The company still mattered. The business still needed his attention. But his family mattered infinitely more. He started delegating, started leaving work at the office, started saying no to evening meetings and weekend conferences. His board members noticed the change, whispered in corners about their CEO's transformation, but Paul didn't care. He'd almost lost his sons. Nothing else compared to that. And Natalie became impossible to imagine life without. They dated properly, the way they should have from the beginning if circumstances had been different. Dinner at nice restaurants where they held hands across the table and talked about everything except illness and fear. Movies where they actually watched the film instead of worrying about lab results. Long walks on the beach where they talked about their childhoods, their dreams, what they wanted from life. They learned each other in quiet moments, building a foundation that had nothing to do with crisis or survival. Paul learned that Natalie loved terrible reality TV shows, the kind with manufactured drama and people yelling at each other, and she'd laugh at herself for enjoying them. He learned she couldn't sing to save her life, but did it anyway, loudly and off-key, usually in the car. He learned she was terrified of spiders but fearless about everything else, that she'd walk through fire for someone she loved but would scream at a harmless spider in the bathtub. Natalie learned that Paul was actually funny when he let his guard down, when he stopped being CEO Paul Morrison and just became Paul, a man who made terrible puns and laughed at his own jokes. She learned he'd wanted to be a teacher before family pressure and expectations had pushed him into business, and there was still regret in his voice when he talked about that lost dream. She learned he read poetry late at night when he couldn't sleep, collected first editions of poets nobody had heard of, had entire verses memorized. One evening, 6 months after the boys came home, Paul took Natalie back to the beach where they'd spent that first sunset. Just the two of them. "You brought me here on purpose," Natalie said, smiling. "This is where everything started." Paul smiled back. "Good memory." They walked along the sand in comfortable silence. Finally, Paul stopped and turned to face her. The sunset painted her skin in gold. "Natalie Williams," Paul began. "Are you seriously doing this?" She laughed. "Right now? In the most predictable romantic spot?" "Let me finish. Natalie, 6 months ago, I was watching my children die. And then you did something impossible. You saved them. You gave Lucas and Liam their futures back." Natalie started to protest, but Paul continued. "This isn't about gratitude. This is about the fact that I can't imagine my life without you. You make me laugh when I want to cry. You challenge me and support me. My boys love you as much as I do." He pulled out a small box and dropped to one knee. "Natalie Williams, will you marry me? Will you officially become part of this family you've already transformed?" Natalie was crying too hard to speak. She nodded frantically, then finally managed, "Yes. Yes, of course, yes." Paul slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and pulled her close. They kissed as the sun set behind them, as the world kept turning, but nothing existed except them and this promise. When they got home, Lucas and Liam were waiting by the window. They saw Natalie's hand and started screaming with joy. "You're going to be our real mom now," Lucas shouted, jumping. "I'm going to be your real mom regardless of a piece of paper," Natalie said, kneeling to hug them. "But yes, your dad and I are getting married." "Can we be in the wedding?" Liam asked. "Can we carry the rings?" "You absolutely can. Both of you." The wedding took place 4 months later in the garden of Paul's Malibu estate. Small and intimate, just close family and friends. The boys wore matching little suits and took their ring-bearing duties incredibly seriously. Natalie wore a simple white dress that made her look ethereal. Paul wore a suit but no tie because Natalie said she loved him best slightly undone. Patricia Morrison cried through the entire ceremony. When Paul and Natalie exchanged vows, they spoke words they'd written themselves. Paul promised to show up every day, to choose love even when it was hard, to build a life about more than success or money. Natalie promised to challenge him, to keep him honest, to love his boys like they were her own because they were. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Lucas and Liam cheered so loudly they almost drowned out the applause. Paul kissed his wife, and it felt like coming home. The reception was full of laughter and dancing and joy. At one point, Paul stood with Natalie, watching Lucas and Liam chase each other around the garden, healthy and happy and alive. "Do you ever think about how close we came to losing them?" Natalie asked quietly. "Every day," Paul admitted. "But then I look at them and remember that love was stronger. Your love saved them." "Our love," Natalie corrected. "We did it together." A year after the wedding, Natalie graduated with her master's degree in child psychology, walking across the stage to receive her diploma while Paul and the boys cheered from the audience, embarrassingly loud and proud. She opened a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting families dealing with pediatric terminal illness, funded generously by Paul, but run entirely by Natalie, with her vision and her heart. She hired staff members who had personal experience with childhood illness, people who understood the terror and grief and desperate hope from the inside. She created support groups where parents could talk honestly about their fears without judgment. She developed bucket list programs for sick children, making sure they got to experience joy and wonder, even in the shadow of death. She took everything she'd learned, both professionally from her years in palliative care and personally from loving Lucas and Liam through their illness, and used it to help other families navigate their darkest days. The organization grew quickly, helping hundreds of families, and Paul watched his wife transform grief and fear into something beautiful and meaningful. 5 years after the transplant, Paul came home from work on an ordinary Tuesday to find Natalie in the kitchen, looking nervous and excited simultaneously, pacing back and forth in a way that immediately caught his attention. "What's going on?" he asked, immediately concerned, his mind jumping to worst-case scenarios, always prepared for disaster, after everything they'd been through. "You look like you're about to tell me something big." Natalie took his hand with trembling fingers and placed it gently on her stomach, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "We're having a baby, Paul. A little brother or sister for Lucas and Liam." Paul lifted her completely off the ground, spinning her around the kitchen while she laughed and cried simultaneously, joy and shock and excitement overwhelming them both. They'd talked about more children, had hoped for them, but after everything they'd been through, after coming so close to losing the family they had, Paul had been almost afraid to want too much, to tempt fate by asking for more happiness than they'd already been given. Lucas and Liam were absolutely ecstatic when they found out, bouncing off the walls with excitement. They argued immediately and constantly about whether they wanted a brother or a sister, about what the baby should be named, about whose room the baby should sleep in until they were old enough for their own room. They drew pictures for the baby, wrote letters, planned elaborate ways to teach their new sibling everything they knew. 8 months later, on a spring morning that smelled like flowers and new beginnings, little Emma Morrison was born. She had Natalie's dark eyes and Paul's dimples, and a cry that could wake the entire neighborhood. She was perfect. Absolutely perfect. A symbol of life and hope and second chances. Her big brothers were completely obsessed with her, fighting over who got to hold her, rushing home from school every day just to see her, treating her like she was made of spun glass and magic. Paul and Natalie stood together countless times in those early months, looking down at Emma sleeping in her crib, flanked by Lucas and Liam, who insisted on checking on her constantly, and marveled at the impossible gift of their family. 10 years after the transplant, Lucas and Liam were 16 years old and thriving beyond anyone's wildest dreams. They'd never developed any complications from the transplant, never shown any signs of rejection or relapse. They were healthy, active, normal teenagers who played soccer and argued about homework and had crushes on girls in their class and worried about getting their driver's licenses. They happened to have an extraordinary origin story, a miracle written in their DNA. But mostly they were just teenage boys being teenage boys, which was exactly what Paul and Natalie had fought so hard to give them. Emma was 8 years old, a whirlwind of energy and opinions, following her big brothers everywhere despite their protests, driving them crazy with little sister antics and questions, and her absolute refusal to be left out of anything they did. On the 10th anniversary of the transplant, they threw a party, not just for family, but for the medical team who'd saved Lucas and Liam. Dr. Chen came, now retired but still moved to tears seeing the boys she'd helped cure. The nurses who'd cared for them through the worst days came. Everyone who'd played a part in the miracle. Lucas stood up at one point and cleared his throat nervously. He'd written a speech, insisted on saying something even though public speaking terrified him. 10 years ago, my brother and I were dying. I barely remember a lot of it. I remember being really tired and really scared. But mostly I remember Natalie. He looked at his stepmom, who was already crying. I remember her reading to us even when we felt too sick to listen. I remember her making us laugh, even when everything hurt. And I remember her telling us that she was going to fix what was broken inside us. At 6 years old, I didn't really understand what that meant. I didn't understand that she was going to let doctors hurt her so she could save us. I didn't understand sacrifice or love, but I understand them now. And I want to say thank you, Mom. Thank you for loving us enough to save our lives. Thank you for making us a family. And thank you for teaching us that love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice you make every single day. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. Natalie stood and hugged Lucas, then Liam, then Emma, then Paul. And surrounded by the people who mattered most, she understood that this was the gift. Not just that the boys had survived, but that they'd all found each other. That crisis had revealed what was most important, that love, real love, the kind that showed up and fought and refused to quit, could transform everything. Paul looked at his wife, at his children, at the life they'd built from ash and hope, and a housekeeper who'd been brave enough to try the impossible. And he knew that this was the happy ending they'd fought for. Not perfect, because life was never perfect, but real and beautiful and full of the kind of joy that only comes after you've survived the darkness together.